Well, welcome to the Happy Cynics today, and thought I'd throw a little extra happy in there for you. Yeah, hope you're all doing well and enjoying the fall weather. And we thought we'd delve into a topic that just keeps cycling around and just kind of talk about the state of public education in the United States. Now, let me say this. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that okay, I'm kind of brainstorming here. So I'm not going to pretend like I've got all the answers for everything that needs to be done. But I do have a few ideas I think they're worth batting around here, and I'd like to get Isaac's feedback on it. And then hopefully some of you listeners, we'd like to kind of build on this and maybe at some point do something where you can interact with us live or something. But nevertheless, we're going to kind of let me start out by framing this a little bit. So Isaac, I think okay, so I hear a lot of students do presentations on public school, homeschooling, private schools, and such. And the one assumption that seems to be jumped over is, what is the purpose of public education? I think that we have kind of a divided view on public education in this country. I think for some people, they believe that the public schools are to serve the interests of individuals. So local school boards, parents can decide what is to be taught in their schools. Other people, I think, have a vision that public schools are to serve the common good. And so it may or may not be the case that individual school boards or others may agree or disagree with what history books are used or science books. Do you have any thoughts on that, Isaac, or any observations here? I'm just going to kind of pause here. I really do think, and I'm going to take the position that I believe that the purpose of public education is to serve the common good. And so there needs to be some kind of central control of it, if I can say that. I don't think it ought to be control in the sense of some kind of censorship or anything like that. But there ought to be at least, like, for example, I mean, why don't we just let each state decide? And we do to some extent, but like, why don't we just let each town decide what it wants to teach their children? I mean, it seems to me that there are some people that would be happy with that. And it's just like, people arguing that people should be able to get tax vouchers basically to teach their kids whatever they want to teach them. I think that there's an argument to be made that for the good of the country, there needs to be at least some common discussion and common background knowledge from which everybody's working and some kind of a platform. So let me pause. You have any thoughts on that?
So
I don't want to put you on the spot here too quickly.
There are two kind of tracks that I'm sort of what you're bringing up is making me think of. The first one that came up was, is there an argument to be made that the state should protect the rights of a child to be educated on certain topics?
Yes.
And do children have those rights in the first place? Can children have rights? And is it the state's role to protect those rights? So that's the first thing that kind of came up in terms of like questions that I'm mulling over here. The other one was, whose interests are being served by the educational material that everyone has to learn? And how do we protect those standards from being manipulated for exploitative purposes?
Yes. I mean, I mean, we could talk about, first of all, so what do you think about the whole thing about education being private versus public?
Well, so that's kind of the argument. Like, it should be private because then it's safer from being, the state's trying to take advantage of you and hide things from you and control how you think. Right?
I get it.
So, if it's private, if it's individual, if it's at a local level, then it's less likely to be taken advantage of in sort of like a conspiratorial way. On the other hand,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
On the other hand, in my experience, most conspiracies that are being manipulative tend to operate more efficiently at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, the children who live in that locality are being deprived of a proper education,
right?
Because of some group of people who has a vested interest in hiding information from children.
What I find interesting is, I don't know, 99 times out of 100, people's complaint with public schools is not that certain things aren't being taught as much as it is they don't like certain things to be taught. It's like parents feel like they have the right to decide what ideas their kids are exposed to. And we're not talking about like, okay, so I'm going to bracket something like, say, sex education, because there certainly is something there as far as like, okay, what's proper level of knowledge based on a child's stage of development, both physically and socially. Yeah, obviously. Okay, that's one thing. But we're talking about like people not wanting their children to hear certain ideas, like fossil evidence suggests that the earth is millions of years old, for example, or that history, there are people like Christopher Columbus, did some good things, but did a lot of horrible things too. There seems to be a lot of, it's like everybody, and this is what happens. Like if everybody wants to, honestly, it's like the old saying, and everybody knows this. If you can't please everybody. And so if you try to operate on to the extent that you can't offend anybody, well, then the only way to avoid that is just to be mediocre across the board. Like you never say anything worthwhile or thought-provoking. I guess that not that public school teachers should be thought-provoking, but this notion that, I was going to save this for my discussion at the end about homeschooling, but I think this principle comes into play here. So it's just like school boards deciding what textbooks can and can't be used. I mean, what is that other than, I can't, let's put it this way. It's like every parent thinks that they have a right to basically shape their children to share exactly their same beliefs. I mean, there are exceptions. There are parents who don't care if their children disagree with them on certain issues. But from what I see and this is purely anecdotal, but I mean, I've seen it so many times. You can't convince me these people that don't think that children should be taught certain things, their only basis for that is because they don't believe it themselves. And they think because they don't believe it, that's good enough reason to basically convince my child not to believe it. So like where do we draw the line? I'm probably going to step on a few toes here, but oh well. I find a certain inconsistency with some of the same people who say we have an obligation to protect the unborn fetus. And I actually support that. Like I'm not in favor of, personally, abortions just because it's a matter of convenience or somebody changes their mind. Oh, I decided we didn't want to have a baby after all. I don't know that's a good enough reason myself. That's just me. I don't know that that necessarily means that it ought to be against the law within certain parameters for a doctor and a woman to make that decision together. Okay, I'm not saying that, but let's put it this way. Some of the same people that argue we have an obligation to protect the fetus, they will basically, though, work against their child's autonomy and the child's right to think for him or herself.
It makes you wonder, is the goal to protect children or to control women? And then extend that control to children as well. And then after children to all of society and beyond.
Well, what else is it? I mean, there are some cases, okay? There are some cases where you have the occasional parent with an advanced degree who wants to stay home and homeschool the kids. And you have the parent that has a graduate degree of some sort and really does have some kind of qualifications to teach. Okay. But by and large, most of it's nothing more than my children have to believe exactly what I believe. Like somehow that's my right as a parent. I think that every parent has the right to shape and influence their children, but to control your children, to keep them from being exposed to certain ideas simply because you don't like it? Like how, if there's some kind of an idea that children are being exposed to that would be harmful to them in some way, then I'd say you have a good case. Yes, that shouldn't be taught because that kind of teaching or ideology or whatever, and really public school education shouldn't really be about ideology so much as like facts. Talk about ideologies, but not necessarily stump speeching for one over the other.
Well, but the argument that they would make there is that, well, saying that the earth is millions of years old is based on the ideology of materialism. I mean, that's the argument Ken Ham makes. Is like, well, these scientists come at this problem with their own presuppositional faith as well as I do. You know, we're on equal epistemic footing because I'm just coming at this from faith in biblical literacy and they're coming at this from faith in science, and it's the same thing. It's totally equivalent. That's the argument they're making. So you do have to deal with ideology at some level, or they're just going to use that to nullify your arguments.
Well, okay. I would hope that for the vast majority of people, we don't really have to convince them to pay attention to what they learn through their five senses. I guess maybe for some we do. Like if somebody like Ken Ham would rather just basically take an ancient story and follow that more and trust that more than what we can observe firsthand as scientific evidence. That's his prerogative. I would like to be confident that the vast majority of people aren't that simple-minded, that, you know, at some point you have to use common sense and you have to face facts that are in front of you. I guess if we have come to a point as a society, let me say this, if we have to convince people to trust what we learn through empirical observation, which includes science, and maybe we're on the dangerous edge of that, then maybe the rest of this talk about, public education, that's all going to be moot. Because if people don't trust their senses, it's like we've rolled the clock all the way back to ancient Platonism, where, but at least Plato used philosophy to try to judge the truth of things.
Well,
I don't think these folks are using philosophy either, or what makes sense or what seems to be rational.
Even Plato acknowledged that Platonism is unverifiable at the end of the day. I mean, even Plato wouldn't hang his hat firmly on anything that he said. And he wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of words on it.
Yes. Okay. Let's do this. So, I don't know. I'm going to argue here. So let me just, not that I've won the point here, but let's concede that if public education is for the common good, all right, what should be some of the goals of public education then? Now, I haven't written down a list here. So let's just kind of brainstorm here for a minute. So what kind of things do we want people to know? I think we would want children to know basic history and science to start with. They should know about our understanding of human history and human beings, what we are, the world we live in, how we're related to other organisms, how we live our lives, how we've survived over the centuries, how we've fought or been imperiled in different ways over the centuries. I would think then that every student should know the context in which they live. So wherever you grow up, you need to know the history. You should know the history of not only kind of a broad understanding of world history, like major events, a little bit of an idea of how different cultures think about like what kind of a basic worldview they have. Okay. But then like a basic history of your own country. Even your own state would not really be out of place, depending on the context, just to kind of understand what does it mean to be a citizen of this country? What does it mean to be a citizen of this state, etc.? That makes sense. Okay. I think children should understand what kind of things have we learned about what tends to help people to have a healthy, happy life. Okay? So a basic understanding of biology and how our bodies work, the kinds of things that produce our health, the kinds of things that are destructive to our health, the kind of risks that we're generating in different ways. And then you move on to, say, human relationships, how we study the way we form our ideas and thoughts and how we communicate with each other. I mean, all of these different aspects of knowledge, and then human creativity. You get into the arts, and then even like phys ed is all part of taking care of the body. See, it's all practical, and it should be practical. I did a little survey of a number of the larger states and looked at what their high school graduation requirements are, and just in comparison. And honestly, over the last 40 years since I've graduated from high school, I don't really see much variation in what's being required or the way it's being taught. And there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, except here's my thing. And I've said this before. I mean, this is one of the premises of me starting this podcast, is that the availability of information has just grown exponentially in the past 2 decades. And the learning curve, like the bar has been raised as far as what does the average person need to know in order to be able to navigate the world safely and wisely. And honestly, when I look at like what some of the ideas that come from some of the older generations, I mean, my generation and older, it's kind of scary. It's like these folks are not aware, at least our younger people, I think, are learning things that, even though this information is available to them, folks just get set in their ways. And so rather than trying to, learn, rather than learn from the facts and then adjust and put them into perspective, people would just rather deny that this is true. And it's like now we've got people who are just trying to find each other to create their own kind of alternate universe to live in with their own sets of facts and such. And that's what kind of worries me. Let's put it this way. Even people interacting on the internet most of them can't have a reasonable discussion. Maybe we're wasting our time thinking that public education would be able to address this. I don't know. I mean, do you think, is this more of a cultural thing, or is this something that can be addressed through education?
I mean, I think it's kind of both. It's also, I think you pointed out, it's a generational thing. When I was coming up through public education, if I wanted to learn something and I didn't feel like my teachers were doing a very good job of teaching it, I went to Khan Academy, which was a big resource back in those days.
Right.
And just learned it for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be rude, but my physics teacher in high school was a bit of a dunce. So I ended up going on Khan Academy after school because I was really interested in physics, teaching myself the physics lessons, and then coming into class the next day. And the way he kind of structured class time was he would give us a problem to work on, and then he would just kind of leave and go do his own thing. And so we would end up, whoever had like a good grasp on like how the problem could be solved would go up while he was not in the room and teach the rest of us how to solve it. So I ended up doing that a lot in that classroom. So generationally, that's not something that could have happened in pre-internet times, that students are just like, well, I can teach this better than the teacher.
Yeah.
So I feel like, Gen Z and late millennials are more empowered than ever before to take education into their own hands.
Yeah.
The problem that has kind of arisen out of that is, your generation and people around your generation have also used the internet to educate themselves through Facebook posts and these like just nonsense resources where they, they end up thinking, oh, well, this is true. And it's just
right.
It's just propaganda. It's a very good tool for propaganda because people see something on the internet, and because it's got like a published veneer to it, they think, oh, because it's been published,
right,
it has some sort of authority behind it. And our generation has been taught to be suspicious of that you need to be more careful in vetting those sorts of things. So can public education address this? I don't know if it could without significantly altering the way it relates to the internet. Because the internet is such a powerful resource for education specifically. I mean, Khan Academy is great, even to this day. It's a very, very powerful resource.
Well, I personally think that children and young people, they want to have teachers who know what they're talking about, who can help them sift through and be able to discern the difference between the false and the true. The things like, even just take a practical example, like being able to detect a phishing email. Even just something like that. Now, that wouldn't be necessarily something you would have to teach in public school, but to have the skills to be able to navigate that. Imagine today, in today's day and age, just teaching a kid basically to read and write and then tell them, okay, now here's the internet. Go out there and you can research and learn on your own. It would be overwhelming. And life has become more and more complicated. So if we go back in time, less education was needed for people to be able to function. I mean, there were many centuries, like in the West, we didn't really have a majority of people being literate until the invention of the printing press. There wasn't really much need because who was going to print all those copies by hand anyway? So why bother? People fault, the Catholic Church kept all the liturgy in Latin. Okay, well, it probably should have been in common vernacular so that people would understand what was going on. But even if it had been in their own language, most of the people wouldn't have been able to read the liturgy and read their Bibles anyway, even if it was in their language. But, so like in that day and age, there wasn't a lot of need, like it was just big deal just to teach people to read and write. And now we pretty much try to have that mastered by the end of first grade or whatever, or maybe at least second grade. At least you're off and running, okay? And maybe sometimes even earlier than that. So it's like you go backwards in time when life is simpler, social structures, all this is simpler. But as we improve our communication abilities is really what a lot of it is. Developing language, developing nuanced language, and then developing, as we're able to form more and more complex ideas, then that starts to reflect in social structures and economics and all the other things that we do. And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So like I've used my grandparents as an example. None of them went past the 8th grade. I had 2 grandparents went to the 6th grade and 2 that went to the 8th grade. But, really, none of them were like dummies and were not dupes. But in the day and age in which they grew up, they pretty much knew what they needed to be able to function as adults. There'd be no way I would turn somebody loose in society today with a 6th grade education. I mean, you have to know a lot more now to function successfully as an adult than you did 100 years ago or even 75 years ago. And that number's just going to keep getting higher. It's just like marriage, okay, and life expectancy, like marriage, the marriage age. There's a reason why we no longer marry off kids after they get through puberty, whenever they're 13, 14 years old. Okay? The family structure, like we know so much more about better ways to raise and train and discipline children than just wailing on them with a switch from the old woodshed or whatever. That was effective in its day and it worked, but we know other ways that can be equally as effective without having to basically wail on the kid. And I'm not saying never, spank your kid or anything like that. But what I'm trying to say is hopefully over time we learn how to be more wise about it. And you learn a little more complexity. And the more complexity you learn on how to do something like parenting, well, then it becomes more of a skill, and it makes sense that over time, young people are going to need a little more time before it really becomes wise for them to marry, have children. And, truthfully, the main regrets that, my parents have had with the way they raised me and my brother, I attribute most of that to the fact of how young they were. Because my mother was 18 and a half and my father had just turned 21. And they had me within a year. So to think, my father, whenever I was a little boy, wasn't much older than like the students I have in grad school today. And so you can't expect somebody of that age to have my father matured a lot between the time he was 25 to when he was 35. And all of us do, you know. And the thing is, I think the bar is much higher. So let me sketch out some of my ideas here, and then we don't have to necessarily pick these apart one by one, but let me talk, okay, this is kind of my premise. Now, if you think I'm off base with my premise, then push back. But I believe, let's put it this way, there's more that we have to learn today to be able to function, but there are things like that were taught in the past that don't necessarily need to be taught today. So like by the time I hit junior high, I knew what a slide rule was, but they were no longer teaching people how to use them. And there wasn't any sense because they were coming out with the scientific calculators and so on and so on. There are certain things like, truthfully, people get all bent out of shape that were, you know, whenever schools stopped teaching cursive writing. But what's the point? I mean, if you can basically print something, most of what we're doing, except for a few handwritten notes, most people are typing things up, even if they're typing them in their phones. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that computer skills, okay, like I remember whenever my parents were in high school, it was like a big thing to learn how to type on a typewriter. And so they had classes, or you just took typing class. But see, now, you know, everybody should know how to use the technology. There should be, you know, some kind of use of technology for, and I'm sure they do this, for doing assignments and things like that. But here's the thing. So what I want to say is, I think we need to actually extend the length of education and at the same time, in other ways, streamline it. That's really what I want to say. And here's the thing. All right. I'm one of these folks that I do believe that public education needs to be extended at least another 2 years, like to cover at least the first 2 years of college. If you want to go to a state public university, then you should be able to get your first 2 years free. That should be, or let's say even if there were just certain state schools that you could go to, like a community college or whatever, and get your first 2 years and get an associate degree, then that ought to be free. That ought to be available to everybody. And that would also help part of the streamlining, because whenever you have, I'll illustrate it this way. All right. I'll illustrate it this way. So we have, okay, so I'm a theology professor. All right. You know all this, but for the sake of our listeners. So we have students that, okay, want to go on and major in theology or philosophy or something like that. Okay. But most of what we do is support for people that are training for pastoral ministry of some sort. All right. Well, here's the thing. We have both undergraduate programs that are meant to be self-contained, where students get everything they need to be able to go into pastoral ministry. And then we also have graduate degrees that are supposed to extend it beyond, but you can't unless you put, let's say, your 4 years of undergrad and 2 years of graduate work, unless you put that into like a 6-year package, students end up getting a lot of overlap and repeat material when they do their master's degree. Now, maybe some of that can't be helped, but let's say this. See, we're still even doing high school as like 12th grade, you're done. We've taught you everything you need to know to be a good citizen. I really think that that's too early. I think that high school needs to be designed in mind for the student who's going to go on and get at least 2 years of college experience. And that way, high school becomes more preparatory for college. If a student wants to finish after high school, they should be able to do that. But I think the dropout age should at least be 18 or when you get your high school diploma. That should be when you can drop out. I don't think anybody should legally be able to drop out before age 18 or before they get a high school diploma. We're not doing them any favors by letting them drop out when they're 16 years old. I mean, we're no longer living in the day and age where the average 16-year-old can go out there and still make a pretty decent living without a high school diploma. I mean, you can, but that is getting more and more difficult. And I'll say this, even if you can support yourself, I'm not sure that the average 16-year-old knows enough. I'm not even convinced that there are that many 40 or 50-year-olds that know enough about the world to even cast an intelligent vote. And if we want democracies to survive, then the voters need to become more informed. Just having internet hasn't done the trick, in my opinion. So are you wanting to say something? Because I'm happy to pause here so you can
I've got a couple things to add to this. So I'll push back a little bit on something that was kind of foundational to this, which is that the base of education is the dissemination of just like common sense facts. Because in my mind, the internet is too efficient of a resource to compete when you have a public that is very stingy with its tax dollars. That's what I'll say. So the kind of the threat to public education that I've seen, and this is very prevalent in my state, and I'm sure it's in your state as well, is this idea that public education can compete and should compete in a marketplace of charter schools and private schools, that there should be like vouchers if you send your kid to a private school, and therefore your tax so you can, private school costs tuition money, but I get a tax voucher that covers that for me. And so it's equivalent to sending your kid to public school, sending your kid to like a private Christian school, or that's what's really prevalent in my area is like these Christian charter schools that are funded through tax dollars that are given out through vouchers to the parents. That's just how it works here. In that marketplace, once you put education into a marketplace like that, where you have to demonstrate value to the taxpayer, and that value is not just, we're keeping the population educated. The demand of efficiency pushes back against that idea of like, well, you can just be disseminating information, the basic information people need to operate in society, without providing additional marketplace value and have a happy taxpayer base. So there's a deeper level of kind of like a capitalist demand upon education, that education isn't just about being a functioning person. It's about job training now. It's about
right.
It's about career more than it is about just being educated.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. Go ahead.
So I think the challenge is like, what does a public education bring that can compete in a marketplace? Can it ever compete in a marketplace and still be education? Because the worry for me would be that, okay, so you're trying to create like an educated voter base so democracy can survive.
Right.
But the people who are going to make the standards that train voters on how to vote and how to think for themselves are not the most ethically responsible people.
No, I agree.
Are in the pockets of people who have ulterior motives for the education of the populace. So that's something that I
Yeah, it
would
may very
wrestle
well
with.
be that everything I'm saying is kind of a pipe dream. I mean, maybe it can't be implemented in the real world. I would like to think, and I do think that to a greater extent, there are a lot of other countries that are more successful at this than us. And I don't know what it is, like whether we're just a greedy culture or we're just too selfish. Everything's got to be about me personally. No, I don't. I think it would be misleading to say that, public education can compete and be just as high a quality as any of your, very well funded private schools or anything like that. I'm not suggesting that. I think that public education ought to be about not only equipping young people to be able to live healthy and happy lives, but to help them understand and accept the responsibility of being a good citizen. And what is that? And what kind of information do we need to know to be able to cast an intelligent vote? It won't do us any good. Like, our country is way too big, and it's just like voting for 2 senators from every state. I mean, how well can we really know these folks? I mean, I guess people could try to, but again, even if you dug up stuff on them on the internet, I mean, how reliable is it? The thing is, we're going to have to, like, the voters need to be aware of, like, what's involved in the issues. You can't be an expert on everything, but we ought to at least have enough, like, we shouldn't be having to convince people we shouldn't have to be convince people all over again to use vaccinations that have already been proven to work. I mean, I understand people's reluctance to use a new one that's just being released, but whenever people start refusing vaccinations that we've seen work for a century, oh my goodness, it's like a lot of it's misinformation, and people don't know enough to know when they're being duped. It's like the person that keeps clicking on the links in the email, and then they wonder how their identity got stolen, because they didn't bother to take enough time. Like, they want to have the benefit of using email, but not know enough about it to know when something goes wrong. That's like the person that says, "Oh, gee whiz, my car was rattling and shaking or whatever, but I don't worry. As long as it starts up, I stick the key in and I drive." Well, you should at least know enough about it. Like, if you're about ready to lose a ball bearing or something, if your wheel's about ready to pop off, you should at least know enough about it to realize that's a problem. Or, when you see smoke rolling out from underneath the hood or something, that ought to be a warning flag that something's wrong. Most people are smart enough to know that, but again, it's kind of surprising. But again, and maybe that's why there aren't that many people that vote, because they don't want the responsibility of having to pay attention and have to become informed to vote. And maybe they just really have no idea for whom to vote, or how maybe they don't even have opinions on issues, except for just kind of agreeing with certain people that sound pretty good, or whatever.
Yeah. There's
ahead.
Another like element to, I think, what you were saying about high school being college prep, and the need for greater levels of education. And I agree with you, but, and this kind of connects back to like education being a marketplace. I feel like a lot of teachers run into the problem of trying to educate students who don't want to be educated. So that they don't have the equipment to be in the classroom, right? They don't have the prior preparation necessary to be in an educational setting. And that seems to be getting worse from what I've read and seen. That there are more and more students who are falling behind and just being left behind. But they're being pushed through the system because they're expensive to keep in. Right? It's not cheap to have a student. So these underperforming kids are getting just pushed out. They're like, you pass anyway.
Yeah, the higher the bar gets, you're going to have more than one track because everybody doesn't learn at the same speed. And when I said about being preparatory, I'm talking about, so there needs to be an academic college track and maybe some kind of a professional track. I remember back when my parents were in high school in the 50s, they had like academic, business, and commercial, I think is what it was called, ABC. And so the academic track, of course, you took the classes were going to get you ready for college. You took calculus and you took advanced biology or whatever was being offered, or like another physics or some other physical science or something. The business, you learned like typing. You learned like clerical skills to work in an office, do like that kind of work. Commercial, you basically took shop classes or went to like a vocational training center where you learned some kind of a marketable skill. And I think those things all ought to still be available. And that's the other beauty about 2 years free of community college, because community college offers a lot of that. Even, teaching kids that really aren't cut out to be scholars and really aren't interested in that, but they could do well just to learn some kind of a trade, where they could make a decent living.
Yeah, I wonder where I would want to draw a line separating, like, at what point are you no longer being educated and are you doing job training? Right. So I think those are two pretty different.
There should be some of both. There should be some of both.
I agree.
Okay, so I guess what I want to say is there should be some kind of a baseline, where you're helping everybody to be a good citizen. But then the other courses that you're taking, they're aimed at one of these, like a specific track. Okay.
So would it be better to separate public education being just like, here's how you be a functional person, and then there's another, maybe even a public service of like, here's apprenticeships, here's job training, should that be separate? In my mind, those are two very, very different things.
Well, yeah. So I think there's a vocational training center in this county. There was in the county in which I grew up. And then like all the different schools used that, and they would send students there, and they would spend part of their day there. Like they would take their basic English, math, or whatever else they needed to finish their diploma in the morning. And then they would be sent, they would go to the vocational center after those first two classes and spend the rest of the day at the VoTech Center. But yeah, I mean, some of that, it's just a matter of funding some of this again.
That's exactly what I was trying to railroad us to.
Yeah.
Because when I was a student, I don't know if they still do this, but I was a student in Illinois primarily, and we took the ISATs.
All right.
And the scores that students got on the ISAT test every year determined the budget that the government gave you for the next year.
Yeah.
And this was No Child Left Behind. That's what it was.
Yes.
That was a disaster, because what that does. So I went to a school called Belleville East, which is the second campus of a township school divided between Belleville East and Belleville West. And we are really close to the East St. Louis school system geographically. While I was in high school, East St. Louis schools were closed. Done. No more school for East St. Louis kids. So what they did, their solution to this was, well, because the East St. Louis kids scored so poorly on these tests and the school lost funding and there wasn't enough of a taxpayer base in East St. Louis to cover the education of its kids, they just sent all the East St. Louis kids to my high school. And that was, I'm sure, good for those kids because our high school had a lot of resources because we were in a fairly wealthy part of, that side of the state. So I don't know. It just seems like having students be bused 20, 30 minutes out of their town to the next town over just to go to school. That seems like you're not investing in those students in a way that's going to, so like back to the students who just don't want to be educated, who will not be educated. The only way to get somebody to be invested in their own education is to invest in them first. But you can't teach someone who's not invested in their own education. So that's where I'm like seeing the cracks here in our public education system is like, well, we fund kids based on their performance and kids aren't performing well because they're not invested in their own education, and they're not invested in their own education because nobody else is invested in their own education.
Well, the problem is in education is assessment. How do you assess how well a teacher is doing? And that's a difficult thing to do because once you set whatever the standard is, then teachers tend to teach toward the standard instead of just teach the subject. And it's like everybody's, again, like you were talking about, that was the problem with No Child Left Behind, is that everybody was just basically, like, most of the learning was just like a test prep and memorizing answers so everybody could ace the assessment test to see how well the school was doing, and it's difficult to judge. I mean, it's the same thing that, like, in college, they want, assessment. You do assessment and such for, like, the Higher Learning Commission and all of that. And then for accreditation. But then what happens is, like, okay, you're supposed to show success because, like, the goal is to have, like, 80% of students get at least a B- or something like that, for example. Okay. Well, what this leads to, instead of, like, everybody just working harder to make sure all the students learn and pass, what ends up happening is grade inflation. So you just change the way you grade, and students that used to get a C or a C- are now getting B- so that you can, adjust the percentages and make it all work. And so the problem with assessment is it's kind of like trying to squeeze one of those stress relief balls or whatever. No matter where you squeeze it, it's going to come out someplace else. And or it's just like, say, tax loopholes in the system. Like, people always find a way to work around. I don't know how else you do assessment fairly and productively without basically having supervisors who firsthand observe what's being done in the classroom. And then, you have to have some kind of accountability, but at the end of the day, the only real measure is, like, the testimonials that come back from former students. That's the real measure. Like, regardless of how tough or easy a professor grades, and this is what I would always consider to be, like, highest praise from former students, is whenever they say, I had, like, for example, within the last, 6-7 years, we've had a couple students go to, like, one went to Cambridge, one went to Yale Divinity School. A student who went to Yale Divinity School said, I feel like the education I got with, from your department, like put me ahead of a lot of the other students. Like that's the best kind of assessment. Like the rest of the stuff where you're turning in test scores and like how many students answered a certain question right or things like that. I mean, that can be helpful, but it relies on people being honest and trying to use it to improve. At the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, the successful teacher is the one who creates successful students. I don't know how specifically you measure that. It's to a certain extent, we have to create a culture that values academic achievement. I remember, so like my best friend in high school went on to become a chiropractor. Well, I remember him saying one time that he was glad that he didn't get inducted into the National Honor Society because everybody looked on us National Honor Society students as just a bunch of geeks. And he didn't want to be in the National Honor Society. And the school I went to, there was a certain point where the top performers were kind of, looked down on or made fun of. I honestly think that that's more common in our culture than what meets the eye. I think people value some achievement, but they don't value high achievement because it makes them pale in comparison. And our country often just goes for the excellently mediocre, if I can say it that way.
So here's
go ahead.
A potential solution I'm rolling around. And I don't know. I would just be curious what you would think. Should everything just be pass fail? Down to the assessment of the professor that you performed enough, you can go on.
Well,
because that would eliminate a lot of the complexity, and I feel like the assessment would maybe be more accurate. Like you are ready to continue in your education based on how you performed in this class. Well, that's more, I think that's more descriptive than, well, you got a C.
Yeah. I think that would certainly help at the upper end. You would still have to face, okay, where you're going to cut off and how how bad does a student have to be before, or how good does the student have to be before they pass, or how bad do they have to be before they fail? I remember even as a kid, it was a regular thing that number of students got held back a grade in elementary school. And there was even a couple like that in junior high or high school once in a while.
That doesn't happen anymore. It's too expensive.
No, it doesn't. And you see people that come out and they've got the diploma or whatever, and then it's like their skills that they have are not developed at all. And they have ability. It's just very sad whenever, well, I've had even a few, say, like doctoral EDD students, like who would even like, and they were even public school teachers that would make the kinds of mistakes like, not knowing the difference between there, and there, or something like that. And it's like, how does this happen? How do people get a bachelor's and a master's degree and not know basic language like that? You can understand maybe somebody misspelling like a longer word, like colloquialism or something like that. That would be a lot easier. But whenever there's certain basic things that you would think everybody would know, I don't know. I mean, and how frequent is that? You get a text from somebody, everybody bring their own lunch, THERE, you know?
Well, in a text, they might have just figured, I don't need to fix it. I do that. Sometimes I'm just lazy. I could fix it, but no, they get it.
Maybe I just still suffer from perfectionism. It could be. Well,
yeah, I mean, the worry with just going pass fail and like it's down to the professor's assessment of the student would be if you've got a bully of a professor who wants to pick on you, that could feel unfair that they're not passing you.
Yeah.
I feel like students are more primed to feel that way nowadays because I feel like that's the relationship a lot of students have with their high school teachers. Mm-hmm. Is that like, well, they're just kind of disciplinarians out to get me if I mess up or make a mistake.
Right.
I was just talking to my wife the other day about this. She had an assignment. Maybe she won't be happy with me talking about this, but whatever. She had an assignment that was late and she needed help on it. She's like, well, but I can't email my professor because I'm already late on the assignment. Like, they don't care that you're late on the assignment. They're there to help you. And I feel like
supposed to be. Yes.
That's a perception that a lot of students don't have, is that like your teachers are there to equip you. They're there to help you. They're not trying to like, they're not trying to, you know, they're not out to get you. They're not trying to make you fail. But I feel like that perception is a symptom of that whole like mechanical relationship that we have instilled in our education, that like, unless you perform in these specific ways, you are either more or less valuable than your peers. Like that whole mindset, which I think is kind of a symptom of the infiltration of job training instead of education, and also the way we make our assessment tests and how they work, that I feel like has created an antagonism between teachers and students.
Well, it probably has. I'm not really sure what I think about that. Anyway, well, I know we're getting a little long on time here. Let me just throw out two more ideas here to you, get your feedback on. I really wonder, okay, and again, I just wonder if we are attracting the best teachers. I don't think we are. I mean, I'm not saying the teachers that we have in schools are bad. I'm not saying that, and they're to be commended for the job they do and such. But there's like, we need to start investing more in public education, but then there needs to be, like, with the better pay and conditions and all of that, then there needs to be a bigger expectation too. I mean, I think security is an issue in a lot of schools, or at least it seems that it is. I'm sure that this is being addressed in different ways. But like, we have to start like minimizing some of the excuses that people have. Like it shouldn't be the case. Like, if somebody wants to get a private education, it should be because, this private education is a little better in some ways than what the public can offer, as opposed to, I don't want my kid going to that school. That is that's a sad scenario. Whenever I hear somebody saying, I don't want my kid attending that school. Well, and maybe those reputations aren't really deserved. I don't know, but it certainly isn't helpful if people already have like a negative impression of what the schools are doing. And here's the thing, and this is part of it as well. When we talk about teaching students what it means to be a good citizen, that there needs to be more objectivity and like a more theoretical understanding of different perspectives, not teachers who are basically giving stump speeches on one particular view or another. And that ends up happening as well. You go to one public school in a certain setting, and you're just going to get a bunch of liberal ideology, a lot of political correctness or whatever. You go to a different one, and you're going to get the opposite. You're going to get a lot of right-wing interpretation and agenda. That really shouldn't be what the public school's about anyway. And I'll say this. If parents can't influence their kids enough in the off hours when kids aren't in school, then how effective, here's the thing. Whether it's a private school or homeschool or whatever, I wasn't afraid of whatever my kids would hear at school because I kept on top, and I knew that I could discuss with them anything that they heard at school that they maybe didn't sound right to them, or they weren't really sure how they felt about it. And I could also, like, if their teachers were taking a particular view, I could articulate, well, some people feel that way, but other people feel this way, and explain a different side. Now, I know everybody not all parents have a PhD or whatever and aren't able to do that. But let's put it this way. If your only way of being a parent is to keep your kids from hearing the opinions of other people, honestly, I hate to be so, I don't mean to be brutally frank, but I really question your effectiveness as a parent to begin with. It's like if you can't help your child process different viewpoints and defend your own, and part of this is that people want to hold views that can't really be defended. And they expect their children to blindly follow the same things that they follow. I don't care whether that's political, economic, religious, or whatever. Okay? Basically, what happens is a lot of children end up suffering for the dysfunctionality of the parents. Some of this is like the parents they can't relate to mainstream people either. And so they yank their kids out from all public squares to keep their kids, make their kids as much of an oddball as they are. So that way, at least when their kids are grown, they have somebody to relate to because they don't have any other friends. I mean, I hate, and yeah, you can address all your angry letters to me. I mean, that doesn't happen all the time, but it happens. I'm convinced it happens more often than not. I'm not convinced that the vast majority of these people are just so well educated and can better explain math and history and science than public school teachers. I'm just not convinced of that. I don't care how many co-ops and other things they have or whatever they put together. A lot of this is just like they don't want their children hearing stuff that they haven't even been willing to face themselves.
So this is I think this for me is the most interesting part of this conversation, is that parents are afraid of their child or children hearing and being exposed to ideologies that are fundamentally opposed to their own.
Yes.
Why? I'm curious, like, do you think that the motivation for that fear is just that it will be harmful, or like the kid's going to go to hell if they believe something different? What is the motivation? What would be so bad about your child having disagreements with you? That's my question.
Okay, my guess, and this is, I'm just off top of my head here. I'll take a stab at this. It's just pure speculation here. But my gut feeling, and from what just from my life experiences, anecdotally, I think there are a few cases like that. It's just like if you go to any church, even a church that's not really mainstream in the way, like the people that are attending it, there still end up being like a few people who are even oddballs in the oddball congregation. Okay, like these are the folks that like everybody else may just turn the channel whenever a show's on the television or like a computer's on a website. You just don't go to it or whatever. But these are the folks that like, okay, no, we're not even going to own a television. We're not going to have internet service here or whatever. There are a few of those. And I think maybe they'd be genuinely afraid that their kids will, be taught something that's going to send them to hell. Let's put it this way. I think a lot of that would be gauged by, okay, what's the parents' attitudes towards people who don't agree with them? I do think there are probably some that view other Christians, for example, who wouldn't agree with them on an issue as they're not real believers and they're on their way to hell. But I don't think that's the case in the vast majority of cases. Like it used to be, like I don't even think, for example, I don't think as many Christians de-Christianize people outside their own circles as much as they used to. I really just think this has to do with the social needs of the parents. I really do. And the reason I say that is because in these cases, they'll often even opt for homeschooling over even sending them to a private Christian school. And why is that? It's just hard for me to believe that that's not a part of it. Whenever the parents themselves don't have too many friendships or social relationships, or they're awkward at relating to other people. And it's like their children gives them like their own little circle of friends.
So then here's, I think, a deeper, potentially more offensive question. And address all your angry letters to Dr. Lowry's house.
Yes, that's right. Well, not my house. You use the Happy Cynics at gmail.com.
Well, but I read those emails too.
You can leave them for me. That's fine.
Well, if you want to send in an angry letter, email us at thehappycynics@gmail.com and I'll send you Dr. K's address.
No,
I'm
you
kidding.
won't.
I won't do that. I'm not going to dox you.
You better not. Listen, I'm not trying to be mean, folks. I actually feel badly in some of these cases, but my sympathy is more with the kids than with the parents.
Well, so
go ahead.
Here's me poking the bear that I think people are going to be upset about. If you're afraid of your child forming opinions or beliefs or even adhering to whole ideologies that are different than yours, here's my worry, that what they're really afraid of is having to terminate their relationship with their child on ideological grounds. And I think that is a symptom of an absence of love for the child. That when you start being afraid that your child's going to disagree with you or learn things that you don't think are true, and the fear really is, well, I'm not going to be able to love my child anymore if they're like those people.
Okay. I'll try to throw a little nuance to push back here a little bit. And maybe you wouldn't agree with my nuance. That's fine. That could be the case where it's like, and there are people who, for example, son or daughter comes out of the closet as LGBTQ, and then they're like, okay, well, if you're going to have some kind of relationship like that, then you're not welcome to come home anymore. I've actually talked to students who were in that situation. I had one student who had to move in with his grandmother. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. So there are those situations. I don't think that the parent stopped loving him, but it's like the love is so conditional that that's the thing. It's not that they don't love them, but the love is so conditional. I guess you could question whether that's really genuine love or it's a very selfish love. It's a very self-centered love that says the only way I can really be close to you or care about you deeply is if you basically conform to my expectations in every way. I understand, like, for example, and I always told my children, I always told our children growing up, I don't care if you disagree with me or your mother, as long as you're not disrespectful. Just don't be disrespectful. If you disagree, then say you disagree, but be respectful of our opinion, and we'll be respectful of yours. I don't think some people can do that. I think at the end of the day, here's the thing. They know that to continue to have a relationship with their children, it's going to force them into a level of tolerance that they do not want to embrace. It's not that they don't care about the children, but it's like they don't want to have to, now they have to choose between which do I love more, my children or my intolerance? Because the intolerance basically keeps them from having to be exposed to certain things. And that's how they justify not exposing their children to certain things or not allowing their children to be exposed to certain things. That's my opinion. That's not a psychologically licensed, trained opinion. But it is a thoughtful academic opinion. I don't think people I want to think that most people don't intentionally do this, but it just creates such cognitive dissonance for them. And I don't know. It's like, why cannot people, well, okay. I've known people on both sides. And I told you about the boy who had to move in with his grandmother. When our son came out of the closet, my parents embraced him and said, "We still love you as much as we always have." And I was like so grateful to my parents and proud of them. Mom's passed away now, but Dad is still loving and supportive. But see, it forced him to grow, to be able to come to that point. Some people don't, they care more about their own immaturity that they want to hold on to more than they care about their children's welfare. And I won't defend that. There are those cases, and I'm sorry. And if you get upset by that, well, that's too bad, because your behavior upsets me and upsets other people, and think what you're doing to your own children. You don't have to participate in what your children are doing if you think it's wrong or harmful. But the notion that somehow there's only one way of looking at every issue, it'd be different. Like if your child come back and said, I think I'd really like to be a mass murderer or something, and keep this a secret because I'm going to be burying people out in the woods or whatever. Okay, that'd be different. But when we're talking about something that is really only justified because of either personal preferences or, say, religious beliefs or something like that, that really can't be somehow empirically proven or disproven either way, you can't give somebody else the benefit of the doubt. I mean, not even your own child. I mean, that's, I don't know. I just don't understand that viewpoint myself. Anyhow.
Yeah. I would have a really hard time. The lines I would put around, like, what could my child say? I mean, I don't have kids, so I don't really know. I guess I can't really speak to this, but if I really loved someone and was committed to that, like a parent should be for their child, the things that they would have to say to lose that, like the conditions you would put around it, I feel like should be so esoteric and weird that, like, I mean, to me, a fundamental part of love is being open to the infinite variations that a person goes throughout their life. Like, it kind of boils down to commitment and demonstration. Like, if you don't demonstrate that you love someone, you probably don't. And if changes to that person's, being, even if they're fundamental changes, should not affect the love you have for them. If you really love them, there should be a level of commitment there that is unbroachable, except by, well, I killed 20 people and, help me hide a body.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my. Well,
I think that's going to upset a lot of people. I don't know if our audience is going to be upset about that, but the people who really need to hear that's a pretty challenging thing that I think we just said.
Well, all relationships at some point require some level of compromise, and some require more compromise than others. Anything I can say, folks, is choose your battles wisely, and a lot of hills are really not worth dying on. They really aren't. Anyhow. Well, I don't know if we've solved anything about public schools. I'll just kind of try to draw this to a close. So we'll have to change the exit music to some soft harmonica music or something, morning and or blues or something. Well, anyway,
we've at least uncovered some of the nuance behind some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there are people that don't even want public institutions to work well because they really don't want to have any kind of accountability or cooperation with their fellow citizens. That's that's got to be one of the issues. It'd be nice to see that addressed, but truthfully, I think a lot of the reason our public schools aren't doing better is because a lot of people don't really want them to, because they'd rather just do their own custom education and basically make children in their own image.
Indoctrination is different than education.
Exactly. Right, exactly. And I'll say this too, and sometimes kids get unduly indoctrinated even in public schools, and that ought not be the case. School is for teaching, not preaching. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe we should do an episode on what the difference is between indoctrination and education, because I think that could be interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I think that would be interesting. So let's we can take up that mantle here before too long, because what does it mean to be? Because we kind of skirted on this, but so like, what does it mean to be an independent thinker? But again, what's indoctrination versus education, or how do we define what education is? So anyway, all right. Is there anything else that that you were thinking of to comment on that? I don't want to draw things. I think I've about hit this topic as much as I'm going to here today. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Just a reminder that Dr. K lives at.
Yeah. Well, folks, thanks for hanging with us. We do mean well, and I and Isaac both want the best for you and for your loved ones. Let's just keep trying to work together, and hey, let's make our society the best it can be, and just keep encouraging one another. And we got to keep fighting the fight. Okay, you all take care, and we'll see you real soon.